"He beat the hell out of me." That is what Big Show said. That is what flashed across the screen. That is what stopped you from scrolling. And here is the thing, he was not alone. Every single person on this list said some version of the same thing. Whether it was the fear in their eyes, the sweat on their hands, or the silence that hit the arena the second that gong dropped. Facing The Undertaker for the first time was not just a match. It was a moment that split a career into before and after. A before where you thought you understood what professional wrestling at the highest level felt like, and an after where you knew that you had never actually experienced that until you were standing across from him. Think about what that means for a second. These are not rookies. These are not people who stumbled into a wrestling ring and got overwhelmed by the moment. The 15 names we are going to talk about today represent the greatest collection of in-ring talent this industry has ever assembled in one place. Champions, Hall of Famers, people who headlined the biggest shows in the world, people who had stood in front of 100,000 fans and felt nothing but confidence. And every single one of them, in their own way, admits that facing The Undertaker for the first time was something different. Something that hit in a place where the training and the experience and the championships could not reach. But here is what nobody tells you. Every single one of them came out the other side with something they did not have going in. Credibility, respect, a story they still tell today, and in some cases, a career that was completely reborn. So before we get into all of that, do us a favor right now. If you love the dark side of wrestling history, hit that hype button on this video. Give it some love. It helps more than you know, and it keeps this kind of deep dive coming. Now, let us talk about what it really felt like to step into the ring, or even just into the same room, with the most legendary presence in professional wrestling history. The Undertaker did not just show up, he arrived. There is a difference. When most people walk through a curtain, the crowd reacts. They cheer or they boo. They respond to a character they recognize. When The Undertaker walked through that curtain, the air in the building changed. People who were there, performers and fans alike, describe it the same way every single time. A silence, a stillness, like the whole arena collectively forgot to breathe. And then the weight of it all came crashing down at once. That low, resonant gong, those slow, deliberate steps, that coat, those eyes, the whole package assembled into something that did not feel like entertainment. It felt like a warning. And it was not just a feeling that the audience had. It was a feeling that the people in the locker room had. The ones getting ready to face him. The ones watching from the gorilla position. The ones who had been in this business long enough to know that most of what happens in a wrestling ring can be explained and understood and anticipated. They will tell you that The Undertaker was different. That there was something about stepping into that ring with him that could not be fully prepared for, no matter how many times you had watched the tapes or talked through the match in advance. You had to feel it to understand it. That is not something you can fake. That is not something a booker writes into a script. That is something you either have or you do not. And he had it from day one until the very last time those lights went dark. Over the course of this video, we are going to go through 15 of the biggest names in the history of this business and talk about the first time they faced him, what they felt, what they feared, what they learned, and why decades later, every single one of them still brings up his name with something that sounds a lot like reverence. We are going to go in reverse order, starting with the most recently built legend of their encounters and working all the way back to where it all began. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly why facing The Undertaker for the first time was not just a match. It was a measuring stick. It was a mirror. And for some of them, it was the moment their career truly began. Let us start at the place where the whole mythology collided with the real world. Number 15. Brock Lesnar. Most first-time encounters with The Undertaker happen inside a WWE ring under bright lights. Brock Lesnar's most famous one happened in a completely different world, UFC 121. Brock had just fought in a heavyweight title fight at one of the biggest combat sports events on the planet. The cage was still up, the crowd was still buzzing. And then, as Lesnar walked past the cage-side media, he came face to face with The Undertaker. And the whole thing stopped. Now you have to understand the context. This was not a wrestling show. This was a legitimate combat sports broadcast. These were fighters, coaches, UFC personnel, and a media audience that does not necessarily care about anything with a script. And The Undertaker still made the whole room pay attention. The stare down became one of the most talked about moments of that entire event, and it was not even on the card. The Undertaker later explained exactly why he was there. He said he went specifically to try to goad Lesnar into something, to generate buzz, to pull Lesnar back toward the world of WWE. That was the plan, that was the strategy, and it worked. The moment was everywhere. People talked about it across combat sports media and wrestling media alike. Two worlds colliding in a single stare down that nobody had planned for and nobody could stop watching. And what it tells you about The Undertaker is this. He did not need a ring to command a room. He did not need pyro or a gong or a darkened arena. He just needed to show up. The aura traveled with him wherever he went. And if you needed proof that his presence went beyond professional wrestling, that moment in the UFC provided it in front of the entire world. Brock Lesnar would later break the WrestleMania streak. That moment shocked the planet, and it shocked everyone precisely because the aura had been protected for so long. That is the Undertaker effect. When it finally breaks, it hits harder than anything else in the business. Number 14, CM Punk. By the time CM Punk got his WrestleMania moment against The Undertaker, he had already established himself as one of the most compelling talkers and performers of his generation. He did not need to be handed anything. He believed that. His peers believed that. The audience believed that. But even Punk, who never seemed short on confidence, understood what it meant to stand across the ring from this man at WrestleMania. Punk's biggest frustration going into his program was something that actually says a lot about how seriously he took it. He was bothered by the idea of being seen as just another name on the list. He did not want the story to feel like, here is the guy for Undertaker to beat. He wanted it to feel like a real threat. He wanted the audience to genuinely believe, even for a moment, that the streak might end. That level of investment, that need to make the match matter on the deepest level, tells you everything about the kind of standard The Undertaker set just by being involved. And then there is the moment before the match, a pre-match message that was delivered simply and directly. Do not screw it up. That is it. No motivational speech, no breakdown of the game plan, just a clean, blunt reminder of what was at stake and who was watching. For Punk, that moment captures everything about The Undertaker's role in that era of wrestling. He was the tradition. He was the wall. You could push against it. You could try to scale it, but you were always going to know it was there, and you were going to respect it whether you wanted to or not. Number 13, JBL. JBL is one of the few people in this list where we have to be upfront about the limitations of the story. Some of the specific quotes that get passed around about his first encounter with The Undertaker cannot be traced back to a clean, verified first-person source, so we are not going to present them as real quotes. What we are going to do is tell you what is real and what that tells us. What is real is that JBL and The Undertaker had a major WWE Championship program in 2004. It was a serious, main event level feud that included a match concept built around The Undertaker's own finishing move. That is not a small deal. That is the company putting two of their biggest pieces together at the top of the card and trusting them to deliver. The fact that The Undertaker was the centerpiece of a major title program that deep into his career says everything about how the company valued his presence and what he brought to a story, even when the audience already knew who he was and what he could do. What is also real is that JBL has told Undertaker stories publicly for years, on podcasts, in interviews, in casual conversations that got recorded and shared. And the way he tells those stories matters. He does not tell them like a guy recounting something that happened to someone else. He tells them like a peer, like a man who was in the room, who was part of the moment, and who understood what it meant to occupy the same space as The Undertaker. That by itself is meaningful. The fact that JBL, one of the most opinionated and outspoken voices in the business, still finds The Undertaker worth talking about, still treats those stories as something worth sharing, says more than any quote ever could. Number 12, Edge. Edge spent years inside a WWE ring, building one of the most decorated careers the business has ever seen. He was smart. He was strategic. He understood the game on a level that very few people did. And when it came to building his program with The Undertaker, He brought all of that intelligence to the table. The pitch he pushed for was simple but brilliant. Two undefeated WrestleMania records colliding. He wanted the audience to look at both of them and genuinely wonder, even just for a second, if maybe Edge was the one who had the Undertaker's number. He wanted to sell the story that the streak could end and that he was the man to end it. And here is where Edge's account becomes something special. He was asked about actually ending the streak. The option was apparently on the table, and Edge said, no, he did not think it should end. He turned it down. When you sit with that for a moment, it tells you everything you need to know about what The Undertaker meant to the people who worked with him. Edge was not afraid of the win. He was afraid of what ending the streak would cost the symbol. He respected what that undefeated record represented enough to leave it alone. That is not intimidation born from fear. That is intimidation born from reverence. And it is the most powerful kind there is. Number 11, Randy Orton. Randy Orton came into his WrestleMania program with The Undertaker the way Randy Orton did a lot of things, with confidence that most people would describe as borderline reckless. He was told to kick things off by slapping The Undertaker, not as a part of some carefully built in-ring sequence. Just walk up and slap him, start the fire, get the program going, and Orton did it. But the moment that hand connected, something happened inside his head that no amount of swagger could stop. The immediate thought was about the receipt. That is the word wrestlers use for the moment when the other person pays you back for what you just did. In wrestling, receipts can be physical. They can be a stiff shot or a hard landing. They are a message. And Orton, standing there after slapping one of the most respected and physically imposing performers in the history of the business, knew the receipt was coming. Orton also talks about the tombstone. Even for someone with his experience, even for a guy who had been in thousands of matches and had bumped in front of every kind of crowd imaginable, the tombstone carried a weight that went beyond the mechanics of the move. It was not just a finishing maneuver, it was a symbol. When The Undertaker locked you in for a tombstone, you felt the magnitude of the moment. You felt the history attached to it. And according to Orton, that feeling did not go away just because you had been in the ring 1,000 times before. Some things stay meaningful, no matter how experienced you get. Number 10, Ric Flair. If you needed one story to capture everything The Undertaker represented as a performer, as a peer, and as a professional force in that locker room, Ric Flair's story might be it. And the remarkable thing is how honest it is. Flair does not try to make himself look brave going into it. He tells you exactly what he felt. He was shocked. He was horrified. Not because he doubted The Undertaker, but because he was terrified of letting him down. He was terrified of getting into that ring with someone of that magnitude and not being able to hold up his end. That is the fear of a professional who understands exactly what is at stake. It is not the fear of getting hurt. It is the fear of falling short in a moment that matters. And then it was over. And Flair looked back at what had happened and described it in the most direct way possible. He said The Undertaker put him back on the map. Those 5 words carry an enormous amount of weight. At the point of their WrestleMania match, Flair's career had covered more ground than almost anyone in the business. He had done it all. But that match, that spotlight, that moment under the WrestleMania lights with The Undertaker gave him something new. It reminded the audience of what Ric Flair was, and he credits that entirely to the man standing across the ring from him. That is not just professional generosity. That is what happens when genuine greatness decides to lift someone else up. Number 9, Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle came into professional wrestling from a world where legitimacy was everything. He was an Olympic gold medalist. He was a genuine world-class athlete in a way that very few people who ever laced up wrestling boots could claim. And that background gave him a different lens through which he viewed everything, including The Undertaker. Their first rivalry had a clear anchor in documented WWE history. But the more interesting story is what Angle took away from the experience of working with him. He did not talk about being intimidated by the presence or overwhelmed by the aura. He talked about learning. He said The Undertaker taught him a lot, that the psychology he brought to a match was very basic at its core, but that it worked every single time because it was built on something real. Angle followed his lead, and his career was better for it. Later in their history, the praise became even more specific. Angle highlighted their chemistry in a 2006 match and called it special. He talked about the Undertaker's ability to adapt, his ability to work at different speeds, with different styles, and still tell a compelling story every time. And then, in a moment of genuine humor, Angle argued that The Undertaker could pull off a five-star lucha libre match if he wanted to. That is the kind of compliment you give someone when you have gone deep enough into the work with them to understand what they are actually capable of. And for Angle, the man who came in as the legitimate athlete, the man who did not need to be impressed by anyone, saying The Undertaker was one of his greatest teachers might be the most meaningful endorsement in this entire list. Number 8, Big Show. Big Show is where the thumbnail lives. He beat the hell out of me. And whether you take that as a description of a match or a description of an entire dynamic, it sets the tone for one of the most human and most honest stories in this whole collection. When Big Show talks about earning his place in the main event picture, the story he tells is not about a moment of instant validation. It is about a test, a long, exhausting, unscripted test. He describes a match that ran over 40 minutes, and here is the part that matters most. They did not tell the referee the finish ahead of time. There was no locked-in ending that everyone was working toward. The match was allowed to breathe like a real contest. Two enormous men in front of a live audience, letting the match develop organically, trusting each other, and seeing what happened. That kind of thing does not work unless both people are completely present. It does not work unless there is total trust between the performers. And it does not work unless both of them are good enough to carry it without a safety net. Big Show had to prove all of those things in real time. And when it was over, The Undertaker gave him the simplest possible verdict. Good job, kid. You made it. 4 words. That is all. But those 4 words meant that Big Show had been measured against the highest standard in the building and had not been found wanting. The Undertaker was not a bully. He was a craftsman. And when a craftsman tells you that your work is good, you know it is real. Number 7, Triple H. Triple H's first documented encounter with The Undertaker in a ring is one of those moments that anyone who was watching at the time remembers as a statement. The Undertaker entered late. He came in the way The Undertaker always came in, with that slow, deliberate, inevitable energy. And when he got his hands on the then Hunter Hearst Helmsley, there was no question about the hierarchy. This was not two equals figuring out their pecking order. This was a lesson in what it feels like when the final boss shows up. That image stuck with Triple H, and it shaped how he understood The Undertaker from that point forward. Because here is the thing about Triple H. He went on to become one of the most powerful figures in wrestling, both in front of the camera and behind it. He had enormous success. He built a career that stands with anyone's. And yet, when he talks about facing The Undertaker for the first time in a major WrestleMania spotlight, the thing he emphasizes is how simple the decision was. There was no elaborate build. There was no carefully constructed story built over months. Their first big WrestleMania program came together late because both of them suddenly found themselves without a clear plan, and they simply agreed to do it. And it worked. Because with The Undertaker, the build did not have to be perfect. The execution did not have to be flawless weeks in advance. What mattered was whether you could step up and deliver when the moment arrived. That is what Triple H learned. And that is the lesson The Undertaker taught. Simply by being the standard, everything else got measured against. Number 6. Shawn Michaels. There are moments in wrestling that transcend the business. Moments that people who were watching in real time still talk about decades later as genuine events rather than just matches. The first ever Hell in a Cell, featuring Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker, is one of those moments. And for Michaels, it represents the most significant meeting point between his career and The Undertaker's. What Michaels describes about working with The Undertaker at the highest level is something that goes deeper than ring psychology or storytelling craft. He talks about signposts. He talks about having key moments agreed upon, fixed points in the match that both men knew they were working toward. And then he talks about everything in between those points being alive, being real, being developed in the moment based on what the crowd was giving and what both performers were feeling. That kind of matchmaking requires an enormous amount of trust, and it requires a partner who you know is going to be completely present no matter what happens. That is how Michaels describes The Undertaker, not as a man who walks performers through a predetermined sequence, but as a man who demands that you show up honestly and be in that ring with him in the truest sense of the phrase. Because he is going to be there. He is always there. And if you are not, it is going to show. For Michaels, whose own commitment to his craft was legendary, finding a partner who matched that intensity was meaningful. The first Hell in a Cell was not just a great match. It was proof that two people who brought everything they had could create something nobody was going to forget. Number 5, Kane. Kane's situation was unlike almost anyone else on this list, because when Kane first came face to face with The Undertaker in a meaningful way, he was doing it as The Undertaker's brother. The storyline was the biggest of its kind in wrestling at the time. The pressure attached to it was something that most performers never experience in their entire careers, and Kane describes it honestly. The feeling was not simple confidence or excitement. It was a layered thing. There was excitement, yes, but there was also a pressure that he compares to being suddenly thrust into a Super Bowl-level moment as an unproven player. You have not earned your spot at this level yet. You have not done this before. And yet here you are, in the middle of it, expected to perform at the highest possible level because the moment demands it. What makes that description so valuable is that it shows the Undertaker effect working exactly the way it should. The aura does not just intimidate, it elevates the gravity of the situation. It makes the moment feel bigger than it would be with anyone else. And that pressure, that weight of being in the ring with someone whose presence alone raises the stakes, is something that can either crush a performer or bring out the best in them. For Kane, it brought out the best. And the story they told together became one of the most memorable in the history of the company. Number 4, Mankind, Mick Foley. Mick Foley's story with The Undertaker is complicated to tell because everyone starts it in the wrong place. They start it with Hell in a Cell, and that is understandable because what happened in that match, the images it produced, the way it is still discussed, make it almost impossible to think about Foley and The Undertaker without going there first. But their actual first meeting came earlier. Foley marked April 28, 1996 as the date of his first ever match with The Undertaker. That is where the story really begins. But Hell in a Cell cannot be ignored because the way it gets remembered in D's own retrospectives, the framing around that match, is something worth paying attention to. The narrative is not just about what Foley endured. It is about how The Undertaker kept the match moving, how he kept things going under chaotic, dangerous, unprecedented circumstances, while also being aware of the people involved. The picture that emerges is not of a man who stood by while something went wrong. It is of a man who stayed focused and present and kept guiding the match forward even when the situation became something nobody had planned for. That is a different kind of story, and it says something important about The Undertaker's role in that era. He was not just a performer, he was a stabilizing force, someone who could be trusted to keep things together when everything else was falling apart. And for Foley, whose entire career was built around going further than anyone expected, having a partner who could handle whatever happened and keep moving was exactly what that match needed. Number 3, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Steve Austin is the defining performer of the Attitude Era. The argument is not really up for debate. His connection with the audience, the character he built, the matches he delivered, the moments he created, all of it adds up to something that stands alone in wrestling history. And The Undertaker was there for some of the most important chapters. Their first major encounter in a title main event is anchored on May 11th, 1997. But the most revealing thing Austin ever said about The Undertaker does not come from the beginning of their relationship. It comes from a later match. A match at SummerSlam at Madison Square Garden where Austin was knocked out early. And when he talks about it, you can still hear the weight of it in his words. He says it still bothered him, that he could not give The Undertaker what he felt he deserved that night. He calls him one of the all-time greats, and the regret is real. Think about that for a second. This is Stone Cold Steve Austin, a man who never had much trouble expressing displeasure, a man whose confidence was never really in question. And the thing that stuck with him, the thing that still sat with him years later, was not a loss or a booking decision or a missed opportunity. It was the idea that he had not been able to perform at his best in a match against The Undertaker, that the other man deserved better than what he was able to give that night. That is not fear of a gimmick. That is the real kind of intimidation, the fear of not meeting the standard when it matters most. Number 2, The Rock. The Rock's first major singles encounter with The Undertaker in WWE's own catalog is dated October 5th, 1998. But the most important thing about their relationship is not the date. It is the conversation that happened before they got into the ring together in the moment that mattered most. The Rock was told he was going to win, and his immediate response was to ask whether it was going to be clean. Was he actually going to beat this man straight? And the answer came back without hesitation. Absolutely. It is your turn, and it is your time. Those were the words, and The Undertaker delivered on them. Now stop and think about what that means. The Undertaker agreed to lose. He agreed to do it cleanly. He chose, deliberately and specifically, to take a loss in a way that would do the maximum possible good for the man on the other side. That is not just professionalism. That is the most generous thing a performer at the top of the mountain can do. The Undertaker was already a legend at that point. He did not need the win, and he understood that. He understood that his role in that moment was not to protect his own position. It was to build someone else's. And that is exactly what he did. For The Rock, that match was a launch pad, and the man who built it for him was The Undertaker. Number 1, Hulk Hogan. We start where the whole mythology of The Undertaker's main event presence truly began. And we have to start with a correction, because the common version of this story is not quite right. The first encounter between Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker was not at Survivor Series 1991. WWE itself labels a July 29, 1991 match as the moment they faced each other for the first time. That date predates the famous title match by months. It was the try before you buy, the test run before the biggest spotlight. And what Survivor Series 1991 actually represents, when you understand that context, is something even more significant. It was the moment the company decided they had seen enough. They had watched these two men in the ring together, and they believed in what they had. So they put it in the main event of their most important fall show. They put the WWF Championship on the line. They made The Undertaker the person who would take the title from the biggest star the business had ever produced. That is not a small decision. That is a statement about who you believe in and what you think the future looks like. And Hogan's own words about The Undertaker are something worth sitting with. Because Hogan, who spent decades at the center of the wrestling world and who understood better than almost anyone how this business worked, could have been defensive about being replaced. He could have been territorial about who was coming up behind him. Instead, he was generous. He called his run with The Undertaker nothing but money. He talked about recognizing early, even outside the ring, that this was a special, long-term piece for the industry. He even recalled urging a meeting during the filming of a project they were both involved in. That kind of acknowledgement, that willingness to look at the person who was positioned to take your spot and say openly that they had something real, is rare. And it tells you that even the biggest star in wrestling history understood exactly what The Undertaker was from the very beginning. And now we have made it all the way through. 15 men, 15 different versions of the same truth. The Undertaker was not just a character. He was not just a gimmick built on darkness and theatrics. He was a standard, a living, walking, breathing standard for what it meant to perform at the highest level of professional wrestling. And whether the first time they faced him made them feel fear or pressure or reverence or all three at once, every single one of them came out of it knowing something they did not know going in. The aura was real. The test was real. And the moment you stepped across from him, you either rose to meet it or you did not. There was no middle ground with The Undertaker. That is what made him different from everyone else. That is what made those first encounters so powerful. And that is why, decades later, every single person on this list still talks about him with that particular weight in their voice. The kind of weight that only comes from having been genuinely measured by something that does not bend. Think about what all four of those shared themes really look like when you line them up next to each other. The oxygen leaving the room, that was not a trick. That was not the lights or the music doing the heavy lifting. That was decades of consistency making the whole crowd feel something before a single word was spoken. You cannot manufacture that with production value. You have to earn it night after night, year after year, in building after building, against opponent after opponent. And The Undertaker earned it so thoroughly that it followed him outside of WWE programming altogether. Then there is trust. The fact that the most meaningful version of a first encounter with The Undertaker was not about hitting hard or working fast or doing something impressive. It was about whether you could be trusted inside those ropes, whether you were present, whether you were honest, whether you were there for the match and not just for yourself. That is a more demanding standard than any athletic test. Because plenty of people can be athletic, very few people can be trusted completely in the middle of a 40-minute match with no predetermined finish. And the legacy pressure without ego. That is perhaps the most unusual quality of all. Because in a business where ego is practically a survival skill, The Undertaker somehow carried the weight of the tradition without letting it become about him. When Ric Flair was afraid of letting him down, The Undertaker responded by lifting him up. When Edge turned down the chance to break the streak, The Undertaker did not have to do a single thing. The symbol did the work. That is what it means to embody something bigger than yourself. And finally, the locker room institution. The fact that his influence, his authority, his presence as the standard-bearer of the business did not stop at the curtain. It was in the hallways. It was in the conversations. It was in the blunt pre-match words to CM Punk. It was in the 4 words spoken to Big Show after a long night. It was in the way every person on this list, whether they wanted to admit it or not, shaped their understanding of what professional wrestling was supposed to look like, partly through their experience of facing him. Brock Lesnar felt it in a UFC arena without a single wrestling element in sight. CM Punk felt it in a pre-match hallway conversation that lasted about 5 seconds. JBL felt it in a championship program that shaped how he understood the business. Edge felt it so deeply that he turned down the chance to end the streak because the symbol mattered more than the win. Randy Orton felt it the moment his hand connected with that slap, and the receipt was already on its way. Ric Flair felt it as fear of falling short and walked away with a career revival. Kurt Angle felt it as an education from the best teacher he never expected. Big Show felt it over 40 minutes with no predetermined finish and earned 4 words that changed how he saw himself. Triple H felt it in an overwhelming entrance that redefined what the final boss actually means. Shawn Michaels felt it in the space between the signposts, in the living, breathing trust of a match that was built in real time. Kane felt it as pressure that became opportunity. Mick Foley felt it in the chaos of a match that became a landmark. Steve Austin felt it as regret that he could not give his best to someone who deserved it. The Rock felt it as a green light and a launching pad. And Hulk Hogan felt it early enough and clearly enough to say to anyone who would listen that this one is something special. They were all right. If this video gave you something, if it reminded you why this era of wrestling mattered and why The Undertaker stands alone, make sure you hit like right now. Subscribe if you are not already here, because there is a lot more where this came from. And drop a comment below. Tell us your favorite first-time Undertaker moment. Tell us which story hit different for you. We read every single one. And do not forget to hit that hype button if you have not already. This is the kind of content that lives or dies on your support. And we are grateful for every single one of you who shows up for it. Rest in peace. That is the only send-off that has ever felt right. And after everything you just heard, you know exactly why.
What happened was, I don't know if you know this, Chris, but it was supposed to be sugar glass and it was plexiglass. So it was accidental. They ordered the wrong glass. So when I was throwing Shane through, he was bouncing off of it and his head was landing on the hardwood floor, the concrete floor. I said, Shane, we can't do it again. He said, do it again. And I threw him the 3rd time and he went through.
You know, Shane had a lot to prove, and getting to that spot where he goes through the glass, and it just, you know, he didn't go through the glass. I'm thinking, we hit the wrong fucking panel. So at one point I'm thinking, no, this is the right panel. He's not going. Vince is all in the background going.
Shane is a madman. Let that sink in for a second. That is not a line from a promo. That is not something a writer put on a cue card. Those are the real words of the most respected man in the history of professional wrestling, spoken about a guy who most people assumed would never belong in a wrestling ring at all. Picture this moment. The Undertaker and Stone Cold Steve Austin sitting across from each other on a podcast. Between them on the screen, a photo of Shane McMahon midair, arms out, falling from something no sane person should ever climb. And neither of those legends is laughing. They are not shaking shaking their heads in disbelief. They are nodding, slowly, with the kind of knowing look that only comes from having watched something up close that your mind still struggles to fully process. Because they have both seen it with their own eyes. They both know what Shane McMahon is made of, and what he is made of has nothing to do with his last name. It has everything to do with what he chose to do with his body, his position, and his platform when nobody was forcing him to do anything at all. Shane McMahon was born into the most powerful family in the history of professional wrestling. The McMahon name opened every door in the business. He could have walked into WWE as a silent executive. He could have sat in a box seat, watched the shows, cashed the checks, and never once felt the heat of the arena lights from ground level. Nobody would have said a word. Nobody would have blamed him. That would have been the logical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that keeps you healthy and keeps your bones in one piece. But Shane McMahon looked at the logical choice and walked in the other direction. He walked straight toward the cage, straight toward the glass, straight toward the 50-foot drop. And he did it over and over again, for years, until there was not a single person in that locker room who could look at him and say, he did not earn it. That is what this video is about. Today we are going to go through the words of 10 legends who worked alongside Shane McMahon, watched him perform, or stepped into the ring with him. These are men whose opinions carry weight, men who have spent their lives separating the real ones from the ones who are just pretending. And every single one of them came away from their experience with Shane saying the same thing in different ways. He is not a McMahon who wrestled. He is a wrestler who happened to be a McMahon. If you are watching this and you are feeling the energy so far, go ahead right now and use the hype feature on this video. Give it a tap. It keeps content like this coming, and it lets us know you want more. Now let us get into it. We are counting down from number 10 to number 1. The order matters, because by the time we reach the top of this list, you will fully understand why a certain Olympic gold medalist looked at Shane McMahon on one of the worst nights of both their lives and called him a brother. That moment does not make sense until you understand everything that came before it. So we start at number 10 and we build towards something real. Here is the thing about wrestling locker rooms that people on the outside do not always get. They operate on a code that has nothing to do with how famous you are or how much money you make or whose son you happen to be. The code is simple. What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to risk? What do you do when the moment gets hard and you have every reason in the world to stop? The boys watch for those moments. They notice. They talk about it in the back after the show, and they remember it for the rest of their careers. Shane McMahon gave them plenty of moments to remember. Now here is what they said about it. Number 10, Randy Orton. Let us start here with Randy Orton, because Orton is not the kind of man who softens his words. He grew up in this business. His father, Bob Orton, was a veteran. His grandfather was in the business before that. He knows what real looks like, and he has zero patience for what is not. So when Randy Orton opens his mouth and praises someone, you can be sure that person earned every syllable of it. What Orton said about Shane McMahon was direct and surprising to a lot of people who heard it. He said, Shane hits hard. Not hits okay for a non-wrestler. Not hits pretty good considering his background. He said Shane hits hard. He used a phrase that became something people talked about afterward. He called them executive hands, and he said those hands hurt. He said stepping into the ring with Shane gave you the feeling of a real fight, not a performance, not a scripted exchange. A real physical confrontation where the other guy was coming with full intention. Their feud in 2009 was built around one of the most personal storylines WWE had run in years. Orton and his legacy faction were terrorizing the McMahon family, and Shane stepped up to defend his family's honor. The creative team needed that feud to feel legitimate. They needed the audience to believe that Shane could be a real physical threat to Randy Orton, one of the most dangerous and calculating heels the company had ever produced. And Shane delivered exactly that. He took the RKO. He took the punt kick, which at the time was presented as one of the most devastating finishes in the entire company. He took big, hard shots and kept pushing forward. He never asked for the easy version of any of it. He came in ready to match Orton's intensity, and Orton noticed. He said Shane never took the easy way out of a physical moment. Every time there was a choice between protecting himself and making the moment real, Shane chose to make the moment real. That is not a small thing. That is the entire difference between someone who belongs and someone who is just visiting. Orton's respect for Shane is built on that shared understanding, that in this business you prove what you are through what you are willing to absorb. And Shane absorbed plenty. He never once made it look like a burden. He made it look like a deliberate choice he was proud of. Number 9, Edge. Edge is a different kind of mind. He is a Hall of Famer who thought deeply about the craft of professional wrestling. He was always studying, always analyzing, always looking for the thing that made a performance work underneath all the noise. He is the kind of performer who can watch a match and tell you exactly why it worked or exactly why it failed, in terms that go well beyond the obvious. So when Edge talked about Shane McMahon, he went past the obvious. He went to something that almost nobody else was saying. He said that Shane's reputation as a daredevil actually worked against him in terms of how he was evaluated. And not in the way you might think. The stunts were so spectacular, so overwhelming to watch, that they became the only thing anyone paid attention to. The 40-foot falls, the glass, the cage leaps. Those images burned themselves into everyone's memory, and because of that, everything else Shane was doing in between got completely overlooked. Edge said Shane had real, natural athleticism. Not good enough athleticism for a non-wrestler. Genuine athletic ability. He talked about the way Shane moved, his speed, his timing, his awareness of where he was in space during a complex sequence. He pointed to the coast to coast as a specific example. That move, where Shane launches himself from one corner of the ring and connects with a missile drop kick all the way across to the other corner, requires precise timing, real explosiveness, and a body that knows exactly what it is doing in the air. You do not fake that. You cannot approximate that. It either looks right or it does not, and Shane made it look right. Edge said something that was almost a little stunning to hear. He said if Shane was not a McMahon, if he had come up through the independent circuit the way everyone else did, working small shows for little money and building his craft the slow way, he could have been a top-tier performer based purely on his skill set. The stunts were not the foundation of Shane's ability. They were the decoration on top of it, the icing on the cake. Underneath all the spectacle was a real athlete who understood the game on a level that most people never gave him credit for. Edge noticed. And Edge calling you a natural athlete is not something that happens unless it is actually true. Number 8, Chris Jericho. Chris Jericho has worked everywhere. WWE, AEW, Japan, Mexico. He has seen every type of performer and every type of backstage political environment that professional wrestling can produce. He understands corporate dynamics. He understands locker room dynamics. He has navigated both of them for decades. So when he identifies someone as a bridge between two worlds that are usually at war with each other, he knows exactly what he is talking about. That is what Jericho said about Shane McMahon. He said Shane was the bridge between the executive office and the talent. In a company as large and complicated as WWE, the space between the people who make decisions and the people who execute those decisions can breed enormous amounts of frustration and mistrust. The wrestlers feel like the office does not understand what they go through. The office feels like the wrestlers do not appreciate the bigger picture. That tension is real, and it has broken careers and relationships over decades. Shane McMahon was the person who lived on both sides of that line. Because Shane was not just sitting in meetings with his father and then coming out to shake hands. He was going out there and taking the same punishment as everyone else. When the locker room watched Shane get thrown off a stage or crash through a structure, they did not see a boss checking in on his employees. They saw one of their own, someone who had chosen to understand their world by actually living in it. That is a completely different kind of leadership than anything you learn in a business school classroom. That is earning it. Jericho also pointed to Shane's mind for the business. Shane was not just thinking about the next match or the next pay-per-view. He was thinking about where professional wrestling was going in 5 years. In 10 years. In 2000 and 2001, Shane pushed the idea of WWE making a move to buy the UFC. The UFC at that point was barely on anyone's radar. It was a struggling promotion that most people in the mainstream sports world had written off. Shane saw something there. He understood that the worlds of professional wrestling and mixed martial arts could intersect in powerful ways, and he was pushing for WWE to be in the middle of that intersection before anyone else got there. That deal never happened, but decades later, WWE and UFC merged under the same umbrella. Shane was right, he was just early. He also pushed for digital streaming before streaming was a real conversation in wrestling. And Raw Underground, his later experiment with a raw, more shoot-style fighting format, showed that his desire to innovate never left him. The response was mixed. Not everything he tried worked perfectly, but the boys in the back respected the attempt. They respected someone at his level choosing to try something new instead of playing it safe. That kind of creative courage means something in a business built on tradition. Number 7, Triple H. The relationship between Shane McMahon and Triple H is one of the most complicated in wrestling history. There have been decades of backstage rumors, family dynamics, corporate maneuvering. All of that is real, and all of that is documented. But when you strip all of that away and look purely at how Triple H evaluated Shane as a performer, you find something interesting. You find genuine respect for something very specific. Triple H has described Shane's in-ring style as unorthodox. That is the word he used, and it is accurate. Shane did not go through a traditional wrestling school. He did not have coaches breaking down his footwork and his timing in a training ring for years. He learned by being around the greatest performers in the world and watching them obsessively. He absorbed it all through proximity. And what came out of that process was a style that nobody could fully categorize, because nobody else had come to wrestling through the same path. But Triple H made a point of saying that the lack of traditional training did not make Shane less effective. It made him different. And different in professional wrestling, when it is channeled correctly, is incredibly valuable. Triple H said Shane brought an energy to the product that nobody else could replicate, completely unreplicable, because it came from a place that no other performer could access. It was the energy of someone who had seen the machine from the inside, who understood everything that went into building a show and a career, and who still chose to step through those ropes and put his body at risk. That combination of knowledge and recklessness created something that audiences responded to in a way they could not fully explain. Triple H also spoke about Shane's work ethic in terms of family character. He said Shane was a McMahon through and through. That is a meaningful statement in the context of that family. The McMahons have always been known for a relentless commitment to the business, for outworking everyone in the room, for believing that the way you prove your value is through what you sacrifice. Shane carried all of that, and he added the physical component to it in a way that nobody in his position was expected to. Number 6, Big Show. Big Show has been one of the most physically imposing presences in the history of professional wrestling. 7 feet tall, 500 pounds. He has thrown people around for decades and barely noticed. He has been the base for some of the most spectacular stunts in the history of the business. And when he says someone has zero fear of the ground, he means it in the most literal way possible, because he has stood next to that person and felt the absolute absence of any hesitation in their body before they went airborne. That person was Shane McMahon. Big Show has talked about working with Shane in the period leading into Backlash 2001 and the interactions he had with him about the spots they were planning. Shane was not asking Big Show to be careful. He was not asking for the modified, safer version of any of the stunts. He was asking Big Show to throw him as far as he possibly could. He wanted maximum distance, maximum airtime. He wanted the audience to see something that their brains could not immediately process as real. And Big Show would look at him sometimes and say, "This is dangerous," and Shane would laugh. Not the laugh of someone being brave for the cameras, the genuine, unbothered laugh of someone who had already worked out every possible outcome in his head and was completely at peace with all of them. There is a creative element here too that Big Show highlighted. In their work together, Shane was always finding new angles, new ways to tell the story physically. The use of a chloroform-soaked rag as a plot device, the constant search for something the audience had not seen before, all of it reflected a mind that was always working, even when the body was in the middle of a dangerous situation. Shane was creating while falling, innovating while on the edge of getting hurt. That combination is almost impossible to teach. The deeper point is this: when you physically put your life in someone else's hands, when you ask a 500-pound giant to throw your body through the air and trust that everything will work out, you are saying something profound about your level of trust and your level of commitment to the moment. Shane McMahon did that regularly, and Big Show has never stopped being both amazed and touched by it. Number 5, Jim Ross. Jim Ross is the greatest announcer in the history of professional wrestling. He is the voice that made moments into memories. When he called a match with full emotion, the audience felt everything he was feeling. His fear became their fear. His excitement became their excitement. His awe became their awe. And Jim Ross was genuinely, authentically in awe of Shane McMahon on a regular basis. Ross used to worry for Shane's life every time he saw him climb something tall. That is not a figure of speech. He has said it plainly. Every time Shane walked to the edge of a scaffold or grabbed the top rope at the corner of a high structure, Jim Ross felt something in his chest tighten, because he had been calling professional wrestling long enough to know that the line between a spectacular moment and a tragedy was sometimes one miscalculation, one slip, one misjudged angle, and Shane was regularly operating right on that line. But Ross also understood what Shane was building toward. He framed Shane as the ultimate overachiever. He said Shane came into the WWE with a giant target on his back, the son of the most powerful man in the business, the person everyone assumed would coast, the person everyone was waiting to see fail or reveal himself as someone who did not deserve to be there. Shane could not have been more aware of that target, and his response to it was to outwork almost everyone on the roster, to take risks that made hardened veterans uncomfortable, to refuse repeatedly and consistently to take the easy path. Ross said that Shane had a deep desire to be a superstar, a real one, not a celebrity attraction, not a special guest, a genuine superstar. And the way he said it tells you everything you need to know. By God, he became one. That phrase is Jim Ross. It is the way he wraps something in both disbelief and admiration at the same time. He became one, not was handed the title, not was given the platform. He became a superstar on the strength of his own sacrifice and his own willingness to suffer for the crowd. Jim Ross saw that transformation happen in real time, and he never forgot it. Number 4, Mick Foley. To understand what it means for Mick Foley to call someone crazy, you first have to understand Mick Foley. This is the man who fell off the top of Hell in a Cell in 1998 and hit the announce table 20 feet below. The man who was chokeslammed through the top of that same cell and crashed through the structure to the mat inside. The man who has been hit with barbed wire, thumbtacks, fire, and every weapon imaginable throughout his career. The man who got up from things that should have ended careers and kept performing. Mick Foley's definition of crazy is calibrated differently than anyone else's. So when Mick Foley looked at Shane McMahon and said what he said, it landed with enormous weight. Foley recognized something in Shane that he recognized in himself. Not just the willingness to take the big bump. That is a surface observation. What Foley saw was the motivation underneath the bump. Shane was not doing these things because he was reckless. He was doing them because he felt something when he was in that moment. That rush of pure, focused experience. The kind that most people spend their whole lives never feeling once. Foley knew that feeling intimately. He had chased it his entire career, and he saw Shane chasing the same thing. At Backlash 2001, Shane McMahon jumped off the Titantron. The fall was nearly 50 feet. Mick Foley, who has seen almost everything in this business, called it a different level of crazy, a different level. From the man who fell off a cell roof. That statement puts what Shane did in a category that has very few members. It says this was not just brave, it was beyond the scale that even the most extreme performers use to measure these things. But Foley did not stop at the stunt. He went further. He defended Shane against a criticism that followed him throughout his career. Some people called Shane a spot monkey. The term refers to a performer who strings together big moments without any real substance connecting them. Someone who chases reactions without understanding the deeper craft of storytelling. Foley said that criticism was wrong. He said Shane had one of the most underrated movesets for a non-wrestler. He specifically talked about Shane's ability to sell, to take an impact and make it look absolutely devastating to the audience watching. He said Shane's big spots always meant something. They were always connected to a larger emotional story. They were never random moments of spectacle. They were chapters in something bigger. And then came the 3 words that meant everything. He said, "He is one of us." Mick Foley, the hardcore legend, the man who built his reputation on suffering for the audience, opened the door to the brotherhood, and said Shane McMahon walks through it. That is acceptance at the highest level this business has to offer. Number 3, Stone Cold Steve Austin. During the Attitude Era, Stone Cold Steve Austin was the most important man in professional wrestling. His feuds, his moments, his character defined an era that brought WWE to its highest financial peak. And at the center of his biggest storyline was a feud with the McMahon family. The corporate machine versus the anti-establishment hero. That storyline worked because it tapped into something real, and Shane McMahon was a crucial part of making it feel real. Austin has talked about working with Shane during the corporation and corporate ministry periods, and he is consistent about one thing. Shane was always ready, always. Before segments, before matches, before any physical moment they were about to share, Shane would find Austin backstage and tell him something that almost nobody in Shane's position would ever say. He would tell Austin, "Steve, hit me as hard as you can." Think about what that request means. Shane McMahon is the boss's son. He could walk into any situation in that company with a safety net. He could take a soft version of every spot. He could ask to be handled with care. He had every reason in the world to protect himself. And instead he was walking up to the most explosive performer in the business and asking him to not hold back at all. He was asking for the full impact, the real version, the one that hurts. Austin understood what that meant. For his character to work, for the Texas rattlesnake to look genuinely dangerous, his opponents had to absorb real physicality and react to it honestly. Shane gave him that every time. Austin has said that Shane's sell of the Stone Cold Stunner is one of the best he has ever seen. The height Shane got on it, the way his body reacted, the total commitment of his collapse, it added something to the moment that many full-time professionals could not replicate. It made the stunner look more devastating than it already was. It turned a great finishing move into an iconic image. Austin's overall read on Shane is simple and strong. He was the opposite of a pampered executive. He wanted to get his hands dirty. He wanted to be in the middle of the fire, not watching from behind glass. He cared more about telling a great story than about protecting himself. And in a world where ego and self-preservation are everywhere, that attitude is rare and beautiful. Number 2, The Undertaker. There is no figure in WWE history who carries more authority than The Undertaker. Not in the ring, not in the locker room, not in the broader culture of the business. For decades, if The Undertaker respected you, the rest of the locker room followed. His approval was the ultimate seal. His skepticism was a wall that very few people ever got past. He was the conscience of the business, its most serious keeper of standards. And in the beginning, The Undertaker was not convinced about Shane McMahon. He was protective of the wrestling business in a deep, personal way. He believed the ring was a sacred space, a place reserved for people who had committed their entire lives to mastering the craft. A non-wrestler stepping into a major spotlight at a major event was something that made him uncomfortable on principle. That skepticism was not personal, it was professional. It was his way of protecting something he loved. But the dynamic changed, and the way it changed says everything. The Undertaker personally reached out to Shane during Shane's 7-year absence from WWE to bring him back for WrestleMania 32. The event was in Dallas, Texas, which is Undertaker's home state. The expectations for the show were enormous. The attendance record they were chasing made the stakes even higher. And The Undertaker decided that for that particular event, on that particular stage, the opponent who could give the match the feeling it needed was Shane McMahon. He called Shane himself. That is not a casual decision from a man who does not make casual decisions. Shane's reason for coming back was deeply personal. His 3 sons had never seen him perform live. That single detail changes the entire texture of what happened at WrestleMania 32. He was not there for the money. He was not there for the spotlight. He was there because his kids were going to be in the stands, and he wanted them to see their father do what he does. That kind of motivation, rooted in love and family, is the kind that makes people go past their limits without even thinking about it. And go past his limits is exactly what Shane did. He climbed to the top of Hell in a Cell, 20 feet in the air, and jumped. He jumped onto an announce table far below. And after the match was over, The Undertaker looked at Shane and said the words that this video started with. He called Shane a madman. He said Shane does not have to do those leaps. He does not have to take those bumps. He does it because he wants to show the locker room that he is one of them. The Undertaker, the ultimate judge, the man who had started out skeptical of Shane McMahon, was now explaining to the world exactly what Shane's sacrifice meant. And then he said something that is almost impossible to hear without feeling the weight of it. He said Shane has more guts than half the roster. Half the roster. Not some of the newer guys. Not the people who are still figuring things out. Half the roster. From The Undertaker. That is a verdict. That is the locker room leader drawing a line and putting Shane on the right side of it, permanently. Number 1. Kurt Angle. Everything builds to this. Every story on this list leads here, because this is where you find out what Shane McMahon is actually made of. Not in the controlled environment of a well-planned stunt. Not in a match where everything goes according to plan. Here, in the worst possible conditions, with everything going wrong, with someone handing him a perfect reason to stop and walk away. This is where you find out who a person really is. Kurt Angle is one of the most legitimately tough athletes in the history of professional wrestling. He won an Olympic gold medal with a broken neck. That sentence is not an exaggeration or a metaphor. He competed at the highest level of amateur wrestling in the world with a fractured vertebra and won. He has a level of tolerance for pain and a standard for toughness that almost no one alive can match. So when Kurt Angle calls someone a warrior, the word has been earned 100 times over just to mean something coming from his mouth. King of the Ring, 2001. This is the match. This is the night. Angle had already wrestled 3 times that evening as part of the tournament. 3 matches. He was exhausted. He was hurting. His body was running on something past its normal reserves. And then he had a street fight with Shane McMahon. The plan for the match's central sequence involved Angle throwing Shane through glass panels on the stage set. It was designed to be spectacular and dangerous in a controlled way. Breakaway glass, the kind that shatters on impact, would have made the spot work as planned. But the production team had used the wrong glass. They had installed reinforced plexiglass, the heavy kind designed to hold up under the heat of pyrotechnics. It was not going anywhere. It was not breaking for anything. And neither Kurt Angle nor Shane McMahon knew this until Shane's body hit it. On the first belly-to-belly suplex, Angle threw Shane overhead. Shane landed on the concrete floor below the structure. Angle said afterward that he broke Shane's tailbone on that single impact. One throw, one landing, a broken tailbone. And Shane's head also bounced off the reinforced glass surface before hitting the concrete below. Angle heard it. He felt the match change in that instant. He leaned in towards Shane and told him they needed to stop. They needed to move to the finish. This had gone far enough. This was too much. Shane had been genuinely, seriously hurt on the very first major sequence of the match. Shane McMahon looked up at Kurt Angle and said 4 words. Shut up and keep going. Not, give me a minute. Not, let me see if I can stand. Not, get the doctor. Shut up and keep going. So they kept going. Shane was thrown into that reinforced glass again and again. His head hit it. His body hit it. Over and over until the glass finally gave way and he crashed through it the way the spot was planned. By the time the match ended, Shane had a broken tailbone, multiple concussions, deep lacerations from the glass that had finally shattered against his body, and cracked ribs with serious internal bruising. He had absorbed all of that by choice, because the story they were telling together mattered more to him than any of the pain. Kurt Angle said afterward that Shane earned every single ounce of his respect that night, but the way he framed it went further than respect. He said that in that moment, Shane stopped being the boss's son. He became a brother in arms. Someone who refused to let his partner down, even when the cost of not letting him down was his own physical well-being. That is not respect. That is a bond. That is the deepest form of recognition one person can give another in this particular world. Kurt Angle, Olympic champion, one of the toughest men in the history of this business, looked at Shane McMahon and saw a warrior. Shane McMahon never walked into a locker room demanding respect because of his last name. He never used his position to protect himself from the physical realities of what he was choosing to do. He walked in, took the same risks as everyone else, absorbed the same punishment as everyone else, and then went back the next week and did it again. He took bumps so that other people would look bigger. He absorbed beatings so that the stars the company needed to build would have someone credible to build them against. He did all of it with a complete absence of ego about what it meant for how he looked. That is the legacy of Shane McMahon, not the boardrooms, not the negotiations, not the behind-the-scenes maneuvering that happens in any major corporation. The real legacy is the glass. The legacy is the cell. The legacy is 50 feet of open air between his boots and the ground below. The legacy is 4 words spoken through pain and determination to a worried Olympic champion in a Pittsburgh arena. Shut up and keep going. That is Shane McMahon. That is why 10 of the greatest performers in wrestling history lined up to say his name with respect in their voices. And that is why this story is worth telling. How good was Bobby Heenan? That is the question. And the answer, depending on who you ask, might genuinely stop you cold. Some people will tell you he was just a funny man at ringside. They will say he never held a world title. They will say he spent most of his career standing outside the ropes instead of fighting inside them. They will say he was more of a comedian than a serious performer. And on the surface, if you did not know any better, that argument almost sounds reasonable. Almost. But here is where the story gets interesting. If you enjoy content like this, use the hype feature right now. It takes 2 seconds and helps more than you know. Now let's get into it. The biggest names in the history of professional wrestling do not agree with that dismissive version of events. Not even close. Ric Flair does not agree with it. Hulk Hogan does not agree with it. Jim Ross, Triple H, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Mick Foley, and Bret Hart do not agree with it. And these are not casual observers. These are the men who were there. The men who worked with him, competed against him, sat next to him in a commentary booth, and watched firsthand as he did things that very few performers in this or any other era could replicate. When these legends were asked about Bobby Heenan, they did not give polite, lukewarm answers. They gave answers that made people stop and rethink everything they thought they understood about what Heenan was doing and why it mattered so deeply. This video is going to take you through all 8 of those perspectives. We are going to go through them in a specific order, building from one idea to the next, counting down from number 8 all the way to number 1. Because the story gets bigger and bigger the deeper you go. We are going to talk about comedy and psychology. We are going to talk about sacrifice and selflessness. We are going to talk about the kind of heat that gets you a police escort out of an arena. And we are going to talk about a single night in 1992 that a lot of people call the greatest performance of its kind in wrestling history, and the role Heenan played in making it feel that enormous. But before all of that, you need to understand something important about who Bobby Heenan actually was. Because most people only ever saw one piece of the picture. Think about what it takes to be great at even one job. Most people spend entire careers trying to master a single skill. A boxer works on footwork and timing. A broadcaster works on the rhythm of a live show. Most people get one lane, and even then, many never fully get there. Bobby Heenan was exceptional at 4 lanes at the same time. He was a manager, he was a wrestler, he was an interviewer, and he was a broadcaster. In all 4 roles, the people who knew the industry best did not just call him good, they called him the greatest. That is not a minor claim. Professional wrestling has produced some of the most versatile performers in the history of entertainment. People who could talk and fight and perform and connect with audiences in ways that went far beyond what most traditional sports could offer. And yet, within that world, Heenan stood apart. Not because he was the loudest or the most physically gifted in the room, but because he understood the architecture of the whole thing in a way that very few others ever did. He understood that professional wrestling was not just about who could hit hardest or move fastest. It was about story. It was about making an audience feel something so deeply that they could not look away. And the real way you do that is not just by building heroes. It is by building villains who are so convincing, so infuriating, so completely dedicated to their role that the audience would do almost anything to see them finally get what they deserve. That was Bobby Heenan. That was his craft. And the proof of that craft is in the words of the legends who watched it up close. We are counting down 8 of them, starting now. Number 8 is Bret Hart. Bret Hart is not someone who throws around compliments easily. He is widely known as one of the most technical, precise, and demanding performers in the history of the sport. When Bret Hart says something is great, he means it in a very specific and deeply informed way. He is not talking about entertainment value in isolation or crowd noise levels. He is talking about craft. He is talking about whether something holds up when you strip away all the spectacle and look at the pure mechanics underneath. So when Bret Hart called Bobby Heenan pure magic, that is not a casual throwaway statement. That is a technical evaluation from one of the most respected judges of the craft in wrestling history. And what Hart was specifically pointing to was something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the hardest things to pull off in any performance medium. He was talking about the ability to make people laugh and still make them want to see you get punched at the exact same time. Think about how genuinely difficult that balance is. Comedy and threat do not naturally go together. When a character becomes funny, audiences usually start to warm up to them, or at least feel less hostile toward them. The laughter softens the edges of the character. The tension drops. And in professional wrestling, if the tension around the villain drops, the entire story loses its power. Heroes become smaller. Matches feel less important. The audience emotionally disconnects from the stakes. This is a real problem that has cut short the effectiveness of many potentially great villains across wrestling history. Heenan solved this problem through a specific kind of comedy that never once asked the audience to root for him. His humor was always rooted in arrogance or cowardice. He was funny because he was delusional about his own greatness, or because he would do anything, including hiding behind his wrestlers or fabricating outrageous injuries to avoid getting what he deserved. These are not traits that make you like someone. They are traits that make you laugh at someone while still wanting to see them face the consequences of their own behavior. That is a completely different emotional experience from being charmed by a character. And Heenan could produce that specific feeling on demand in any arena against any opponent on any given night. Hart also made the point that Heenan's comedy never detracted from the seriousness of what was happening in the ring. It actually enhanced it. That is the real genius. Most performers have to choose between being funny and being credible. Heenan did not make that choice. He did both, on the same stage, in front of the same audience, without ever breaking the internal logic of who his character was. Bret Hart concluded that there was no one like Bobby Heenan before him, and there would be no one like him again. Coming from the Hitman, with everything that carries, that is about as meaningful a compliment as exists in the wrestling world. Number 7 is Mick Foley. Mick Foley built his entire reputation on one thing above almost all else: sacrifice. He is a man who threw himself off steel structures, allowed himself to be set on fire, and took physical falls that would have ended most professional careers just to give the audience a moment they would never forget. So when Mick Foley talks about selflessness in professional wrestling, he is speaking from a place of personal experience that almost no one else in the history of the business can match. And when Foley identifies Bobby Heenan as one of the most selfless performers he ever witnessed, that carries a weight that deserves to be taken seriously. Here is what Foley was pointing to. In professional wrestling, every story eventually needs a payoff. The audience goes through the journey of watching the villain win, cheat, lie, and cause suffering across weeks and months of storytelling. They build up frustration and genuine anger, and at some point that frustration needs a release. The bad guy has to get what is coming to them. That release is what makes the hero feel like a real hero. Without it, the whole story falls completely flat. In wrestling, the villain getting their comeuppance often means taking a physical beating in front of the audience. And how that moment actually lands depends entirely on how the villain reacts to it. A weak or uninvested reaction from the villain makes the hero look average. A committed and explosive reaction from the villain makes the hero look like $1 million. Bobby Heenan understood this better than almost anyone who ever stood at ringside, and he acted on that understanding every single time. Foley called Heenan a bumping machine. In wrestling, a bump is when you take a fall and react in a way that makes the other person's move look devastating. Most managers did not take bumps. They stood at ringside, looked nervous, occasionally got grabbed by the collar, and stayed safe. Heenan did none of that. He flew over the ropes. He flipped completely onto his face. He tumbled across the arena floor. He made every physical consequence look like the most painful thing that had ever happened. And every time he did it, the crowd erupted. And every time the crowd erupted, the hero of the story looked 10 feet tall. Foley's deeper point was not just that Heenan was physically capable enough to do these things. The point was that Heenan chose to do them, consistently and without complaint, throughout his career. He had the skill to protect himself more carefully. He had the character and the stature to play things much more safely. But he consistently chose to do whatever it took to make every moment bigger for everyone else involved. That is the definition of selflessness in a performance setting. And according to Mick Foley, Bobby Heenan did it better and more consistently than anyone. Number 6 is Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels became one of the biggest stars in professional wrestling history, but there was a point in his career where that was far from guaranteed. He was known as a gifted tag team performer, but the question of whether he could carry the company as a single star was still very much open. And in that critical transition period, Bobby Heenan played a role that Michaels himself pointed to as being genuinely important to how his career developed. Here is what Heenan understood that others sometimes missed. In professional wrestling, the words spoken about a performer often matter just as much as the performances themselves. If the audience hears a respected voice saying, night after night, that a certain performer is special, that they are the future, that they are the most gifted athlete in the building, the audience starts to believe it. They start to look for the evidence to confirm what they are being told. And because Heenan was so convincing, so specific, and so consistent in his advocacy, the audience trusted the message he was delivering. Heenan called Michaels the star of the 90s. He predicted a future championship with complete confidence. He said Michaels was probably one of the most gifted athletes he had ever come across in his time in the business. He described Michaels' arrogance not as a character flaw, but as confidence that was completely and totally justified by the talent on display. Through that framing, night after night, Michaels transformed from a promising young talent into someone the audience could genuinely believe in as a future main event performer. The narrative was being written from the commentary booth as much as it was being written in the ring. Heenan also played a significant role in building the prestige of the Intercontinental Championship during this era. This was not the top title in the company. But through Heenan's relentless advocacy of champions like Mr. Perfect, the Intercontinental Belt became known as the Workers' Belt, the championship held by the most technically gifted and most genuinely skilled performers in the business. It had real value. It had story behind it. It had weight. And that weight transferred directly to the performers who held it or chased it, including a young Shawn Michaels, who was still proving himself on that stage. Michaels summed up the entire dynamic in one clean line that could not be more direct. He said that if you were with Bobby, you were important. That is the impact of a manager who understood that his job was not to chase championships for himself, but to make everyone he believed in feel like they absolutely deserved one. Number 5 is The Undertaker. The Undertaker is one of the most carefully protected characters in the history of professional wrestling. For decades, he maintained an aura of dominance and mystery that very few performers across any era have ever been able to sustain at that level. He is not someone who throws praise around carelessly. When The Undertaker speaks about another performer's ability, he is making a statement that carries the full weight of his reputation behind it. What The Undertaker recognized in Bobby Heenan was something that goes to the absolute foundation of what makes professional wrestling function. He recognized Heenan's ability to generate what the industry calls heat. For anyone who may not be familiar with that term, heat is the genuine anger and hostility of the crowd directed at the villain. Not mild boredom, not polite disapproval, not casual indifference. Real, boiling, visceral hatred that fills an arena from floor to ceiling and makes the air itself feel charged with emotion. Heat matters enormously because it is the primary fuel that powers the hero's story. A hero is only as impressive as the obstacle they are forced to overcome. And if the villain cannot generate real and convincing heat from the audience, the obstacle feels small and the hero's eventual victory feels hollow. Heenan was, according to The Undertaker, the ultimate antagonist. He could make 30,000 people in an arena want to genuinely harm him with just a single look across the building. Not a lengthy speech, not an elaborate plot or scheme, just a look. And here is where it becomes genuinely serious. The Undertaker was not speaking in theatrical terms or exaggerating for effect. The heat that Heenan generated was sometimes so intense that it crossed the line from theatrical anger into something that felt genuinely dangerous. The Heenan family, his managed group of wrestlers, regularly required police escorts just to leave arenas safely. Not as part of the show, not as a performance element, because the crowds were that angry. Because Heenan had done such a complete job of convincing them that he was a legitimate source of their frustration, that the line between what was real and what was performance blurred for thousands of people simultaneously. That is an extraordinary achievement. And it is also an extraordinary commitment to a role, because generating that level of heat means staying in character with absolutely no breaks, no moments of goodwill toward the crowd, no softening of the edges. It means being willing to absorb the full force of an entire arena's anger and channel it into making every hero who faced you into a bigger star. The Undertaker saw exactly what Heenan was doing and understood why it required a level of discipline and courage that most performers never had to face. Number 4 is Triple H. Triple H has spent his career in professional wrestling in nearly every capacity that exists. He has been a top-level performer in the ring. He has been an executive who shaped the direction of the entire company. He has studied the business of wrestling with an intensity that very few people in any industry ever apply to their own craft. So when Triple H makes a judgment about the value of a career choice, he is not speaking from a casual or uninformed place. He is speaking from a deep and hard-earned understanding of what it costs to choose one path over another and what the full consequences of that choice mean for everyone involved. His perspective on Bobby Heenan centers on one specific and genuinely remarkable fact. Heenan had everything required to be a world champion in professional wrestling. The physical look, the athletic ability, the promotional skills to sell tickets and connect with audiences, the charisma to command a room from the moment he entered it. In any territory during any point of his peak years, he could have pursued the top championship and, based on what the people closest to the business observed, likely achieved it. That was not a fantasy or wishful thinking. That was a realistic path that genuinely existed. He did not take it. Instead, he chose the role of manager. And Triple H's central point is that this was not a failure of ambition or a settling for something less. It was an act of real understanding about where his maximum value lay. Heenan recognized that a great wrestler can carry a single match. They can take an audience on a journey for 30 or 60 minutes and deliver something memorable that people will talk about for years. But a great manager can carry an entire roster at the same time. A great manager provides the emotional foundation that makes a dozen different storylines all work simultaneously. A great manager becomes the single focal point of antagonism that allows wrestlers across every level of the card to benefit from the audience's investment in the overall story. By choosing to be the manager the promotion needed rather than the champion he personally could have been, Heenan multiplied his value many times over. Every member of the Heenan family benefited. Every hero who faced them benefited. Every match that carried his name benefited. Triple H called this true greatness, and it is hard to argue when you look at the scale of the impact. Heenan chose collective elevation over personal accolades, and the industry was significantly better for it in ways that a championship reign, no matter how prestigious, could never have replicated. Number 3 is Jim Ross. Jim Ross is the voice of professional wrestling's most successful era. He was behind the microphone for some of the most significant moments in the history of the industry. He studied broadcasting with the same seriousness that elite athletes apply to their training. He is not someone who identifies a gold standard lightly, and Jim Ross called Bobby Heenan the gold standard of color commentary. The specific detail he kept returning to was what became known among insiders as the no-notes standard. During 3-hour live broadcasts, sometimes in front of enormous pay-per-view audiences, Heenan performed without a single written note in front of him. He did not have a prepared cheat sheet. He did not have a list of talking points. He did not have a rundown of things to say when a specific performer entered the match or a specific moment unfolded in the ring. What he had was mastery, total, complete, internalized mastery of every performer, every storyline, every character dynamic, and every crowd reaction pattern that might come up during a broadcast. He could react to anything that happened in real time with perfect timing, and perfect instinct. He could make a joke during a slow moment in a match without once interrupting the natural rhythm of the action. He could provide insight into a wrestling technique without making the audience feel like they were sitting through a clinical demonstration. He could shift from pure comedy to genuine urgency without any visible seam showing between the two modes. Ross also specifically pointed to the partnership between Heenan and Gorilla Monsoon as the definitive blueprint for commentary chemistry in professional wrestling. Monsoon played the role of the credible, legitimate, athletic voice of reason. He was the straight man. He was the one who respected the competition and took the sport seriously. Heenan played the delusional, completely committed advocate for his side. He was the comedian. He was the one who treated every rule as a suggestion and every opponent as an obstacle to be insulted. Together, they created something that felt less like a professional broadcast and more like a genuine friendship between two people who agreed on almost nothing but genuinely cared about each other anyway. That combination, that specific and irreplaceable chemistry, became the template the entire industry has been attempting to recreate ever since. The no-notes detail matters more than it might appear. It was not a trick. It was the result of a complete investment in the world he was describing. Heenan did not need notes because that world was not foreign territory. It was his world. He had wrestled in it. He had managed in it. He had lived every corner of it for decades. When you know something that deeply, you do not need reminders. You just speak. Number 2 is Hulk Hogan. For a decade or more, Bobby Heenan was the primary obstacle in Hulk Hogan's professional wrestling life. On screen, they were bitter enemies. Heenan's stable of managed wrestlers existed largely to challenge Hogan's dominance and create the conflicts that drove the WWF's most commercially successful storylines. If you only watch the television programs and never look behind the curtain, you might assume Hogan had nothing but contempt for the man who caused him so much on-screen grief. The reality is exactly the opposite. Hogan's off-screen assessment of Heenan is one of the most surprising and genuinely revealing pieces of testimony in this entire countdown. Because Hogan did not simply offer polite professional respect for Heenan, he placed him in the same conversation as the finest technical wrestlers in the entire history of the sport. Specifically, Hogan compared Heenan's in-ring ability to Bret Hart, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Ricky Steamboat. Those 3 names represent a very specific tier of excellence. They are the kind of names that define what technical mastery in professional wrestling looks like. You do not attach those names to someone as a casual courtesy. You attach them to someone when you genuinely believe the comparison is accurate and deserved. Hogan was pointing to a dimension of Heenan's career that most audiences simply never got to fully see or appreciate. Before Heenan became the brain of the WWF, before he became the comedic manager in the sharp suit, standing at ringside with a knowing smirk, he was a legendary wrestler in the American Wrestling Association. He had the complete set of tools. He had the timing. He had the technical understanding of the craft at a physical level that went far beyond what his later managerial persona ever suggested to a general audience. What made Heenan extraordinary in the ring was not power or size. It was what Hogan described as the little things: timing, positioning, selling, the ability to make his opponent look better than they would have looked against almost anyone else. These are the elements that separate genuinely great wrestlers from merely good ones. They are subtle. They do not end up on highlight reels, but the people who spent their careers inside the business can identify them instantly, and Hogan saw them clearly in Heenan every time they shared the same space. The other dimension Hogan highlighted was how Heenan used his position strategically to protect and elevate the wrestlers in his family. By consistently absorbing the full concentrated force of the crowd's anger himself, Heenan allowed performers like Andre the Giant and King Kong Bundy to remain physically imposing and truly threatening figures in the audience's mind. If the crowd's frustration had no single focal point, it would have spread across all the villains and diluted the heat for everyone involved. By being the primary and most visible target himself, Heenan concentrated that energy in a way that made every physical threat in his group feel more dangerous and more significant by direct association. That is a strategic and deeply selfless contribution that most fans watching at home never consciously identified, but felt in every match. Number 1, is Ric Flair. We have built through 7 legends now, and each one has added a distinct and important layer to the overall picture. Comedy without compromise. Selfless bumps that make heroes shine brighter. The power of words to create genuine importance in the eyes of an audience. The danger and total discipline required to generate real heat. The sacrifice of personal glory in exchange for collective success. The mastery of a 3-hour live broadcast without a single written note. The hidden and largely unseen brilliance of the most sophisticated in-ring technician that most people did not realize they were watching. All of those layers converge in the story that Ric Flair tells, because the 1992 Royal Rumble is the event that most clearly demonstrates what Bobby Heenan was capable of when he had a stage large enough to show everything at once. The 1992 Royal Rumble is consistently cited as the greatest version of that match in its entire history. Ric Flair entered at number 3, which meant he had to survive inside the ring, while 29 other wrestlers entered after him, each one trying to eliminate him by throwing him over the top rope. He lasted over 60 minutes from start to finish. He absorbed everything the match threw at him. He found a way to survive every elimination attempt. And when it was finally over, he had won the vacant WWF World Heavyweight Championship. It remains one of the most remarkable individual endurance performances in the history of the sport. But here is what Flair himself has consistently maintained. The match would not have been what it was without Bobby Heenan working on commentary alongside Gorilla Monsoon. Think carefully about what Heenan was actually doing during those 60-plus minutes. He was not simply watching and describing a match to the audience. He was living it. Every time a new opponent entered the ring, Heenan's anxiety was completely audible. Every time Flair came dangerously close to elimination, the desperation in Heenan's voice was real and visceral. Every time Flair survived another threatening situation, Heenan's relief and vindication exploded out of him with full force. He was not providing a commentary track. He was experiencing the entire event in real time alongside the audience, at full emotional volume, for an hour straight, without ever losing the thread of the narrative he was building. This approach was built on a sophisticated and deliberate understanding of how great commentary actually functions. Heenan knew that his job was not simply to describe what was visually happening in the ring. His job was to tell the audience what to feel about what was happening. And to do that effectively over the full length of that match, he had to stay completely committed to his character and his perspective without any softening or breaking of the performance. Part of that commitment involved a very careful psychological strategy worth understanding in full. Heenan would never offer a genuine criticism of any babyface, any hero in the match, that could actually damage that performer's reputation with the audience. He had no interest in genuinely harming anyone's professional standing. So instead, he used exaggerated, obviously character-based insults that were funny and outrageous, but never truly damaging to the professional integrity of anyone involved. Claiming a wrestler was slow or questioning someone's intelligence in theatrical, over-the-top terms was not real criticism. It was performance. And by keeping his attacks firmly in the realm of obvious exaggeration, he maintained his heel voice without doing any actual harm to the people he was technically mocking. Fair to Flair was not just a catchphrase that people remember fondly. It was a narrative anchor that forced the audience to engage with Flair's importance in a direct and active way. It required them to respond to the argument being made, even if that response was disagreement and frustration. And because Heenan was making the argument with absolute sincerity and total unwavering commitment, even the audience members who strongly disliked Flair found themselves paying closer attention. That is the specific power of a great advocate. They make you argue back. They make you engage emotionally with the story. And emotional engagement is the most important ingredient in any form of entertainment. Flair also came to the WWF carrying the prestige of the NWA Championship, a title from a competing organization that held enormous respect among serious wrestling fans. Heenan understood this prestige needed to be imported and established for a new audience. So he did not simply manage Flair, he contextualized him. He told the WWF audience, week after week, why Flair was the real world's champion, why his credentials were unmatched, and why every other performer in the WWF was essentially operating in his shadow. It was a deliberate, sustained campaign of narrative positioning that worked precisely as Heenan intended. And here is what brings the entire picture together into one complete idea. Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan were not merely professional partners during the broadcast of the 1992 Royal Rumble, or during any of the years they worked together on television. They were genuine and deeply close friends. Heenan himself acknowledged this and spoke about it openly and with real warmth. And that friendship was the invisible foundation beneath everything their broadcast chemistry produced together. Monsoon was the exasperated, credible voice of sporting reason. Heenan was the relentless, confident, and perpetually delusional advocate for his side. They pushed against each other constantly. They disagreed on essentially everything that happened on screen, but underneath all of it was a real bond that the audience could sense, even when they could not articulate exactly what they were feeling. And that authenticity made every frustrated response from Monsoon land with genuine weight. It made every outrageous claim from Heenan feel like it came from a real and internally consistent place, even when the claim itself was completely absurd. Heenan once noted that the brain was the best character in the business because people expected a certain kind of behavior from him. They expected the delusion. They expected the creative reinterpretation of events. They expected the confident wrongness, which meant that the character could absorb any stumble, any unexpected moment, and make it fit seamlessly into who the brain was. He had built a persona so internally consistent and so completely realized that even its flaws and mistakes became part of its appeal. That is a level of character craftsmanship that very few performers in any medium ever achieve. The Heenan-Monsoon partnership became the template for every effective commentary duo that came after it. The credible voice paired with the invested advocate, the straight man and the joker. The person who respects the rules working alongside the person who treats rules as creative suggestions. Every time a commentary team in professional wrestling has generated genuine chemistry since those years, they have been working from the model that Heenan and Monsoon created together. The specific one-liners Heenan was known for, the Heenanisms that wrestling fans still quote with joy decades later, are worth a moment of real appreciation on their own terms. A friend in need is a pest. That single line tells you the entire worldview of the character in 6 words. When a famous incident involving Marty Jannetty and a window occurred on screen, Heenan instantly reframed it as an act of cowardice on Jannetty's part, rather than an act of aggression against him. When Hulk Hogan pointed to the crowd in his iconic pre-match gesture, Heenan suggested he was simply demonstrating how high he could count. Every one of these moments does the same precise thing. It takes a situation the audience has already interpreted one way and offers a completely opposite interpretation, delivered with total and unshakable confidence. The confidence is what makes it land every single time. Heenan never hedged. He never softened the edge of a line. He said what the brain would say and let the audience push back with every bit of noise they had. That is the full picture of everything these 8 legends were pointing to when they talked about Bobby Heenan and why he mattered to the business and to all of them personally. They were not simply saying he was talented. They were saying he understood the mechanics of how the whole system functioned better than almost anyone else in the history of the business. He understood that heroes are built by the quality of the resistance placed in front of them. He understood that a manager's greatest achievement is not a personal accolade, but the elevation of the people around them. He understood that comedy, when it is properly rooted in character rather than in crowd-pleasing for its own sake, makes the drama stronger rather than weaker. He understood that performing a 3-hour live broadcast without notes is only possible when you have internalized the world you are describing so completely that speaking about it is as natural as having a conversation. Bobby Heenan passed away in 2017 due to complications from throat cancer after a long and genuinely difficult illness that tested him in ways his career never had. He faced that illness with a version of the same spirit he had brought to everything else in his professional life. The wrestling world mourned him in the way it mourns very few people, with the recognition that the space he had occupied could not simply be filled by whoever came next. The archetypes he created, the financial advisor character, the heel broadcast voice, the bumping manager who made heroes look enormous, continue to shape the way modern performers think about and approach their own roles in the business. Paul Heyman and others who came in the generations after him have drawn clearly and directly from the blueprint Heenan established over decades of work. But the real measure of any performer's legacy is not in the people they influence from a distance or the performers who came after them. It is in the words of the people who were actually there, who stood across from them in arenas, who shared booths with them on live broadcasts, who watched up close as they did the work night after night. Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Jim Ross, Triple H, The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Mick Foley, Bret Hart, 8 legends spanning different wrestling styles, different eras, and different roles within the industry, all arriving independently at the same essential conclusion, that Bobby the Brain Heenan was not simply an important supporting figure in the story of professional wrestling. He was one of its most essential architects, a multiplier of talent, a builder of heroes, a standard setter for every broadcaster, every manager, and every performer who followed in his footsteps, and a man whose sophistication, selflessness, and complete mastery of his craft placed him in a category that, as Bret Hart himself said, may genuinely never be occupied by anyone else again. He was never the biggest star in the room, but every big star in the room became bigger because of him. And when you truly understand that, the question stops being how good Bobby Heenan was. The real question becomes whether we will ever see anything like him again. And based on everything these 8 legends said, the honest answer is probably not.